In 2019, 80 years after the Second World War erupted across Europe, the grave of one of the most high-ranking Nazi officials was disturbed and dug up. Reinhard Heydrich was known as a butcher of Prague, and he had been buried in an unmarked grave inside of Berlin following his assassination in 1942. Heydrich succumbed to his injuries, and he was a man who was responsible for the slaughter, execution, and torture of hundreds of thousands of people, as he oversaw much of the killing of the concentration camps. Whoever violated the grave of Heydrich clearly knew what they were looking for, and they knew that inside of the Invalidenfriedhof, a place where thousands of burials were, that the former blonde beast was buried specifically there. It's not known what specifically they were looking for, possibly his SS sword, it's believed, that he was buried with, but Heydrich was not the only person whose grave was disturbed over the years after the war. One high-ranking Nazi official even had his bones dug up and cremated because of the attention his grave brought, and Hitler's own parents, it's believed, may have even had their remains removed from their grave. Welcome to The Untold Past. Today we look at the exhumations of the World War II Nazis, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Rudolf Hess was a Deputy Fuhrer of the Nazi Party, and he was a man who was utterly devoted to Hitler after hearing him speak for the first time in 1920. He was member number 16 of the Nazi Party, and was involved in fundraising to begin with, and was even injured trying to protect Hitler following a bomb which exploded at the Hofbrau house. He was part of the Munich Putsch and had taken a few people hostage and taken them 30 miles away from Munich, but when he left to make a phone call, the hostages then managed to escape. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison for his involvement in the attempted coup, and it was Hess who was involved in writing and editing Hitler's book Mein Kampf. But he was a man who was a keen flyer, and he had a private pilot's license, but inside of the Nazi Party, he rose to the position of Deputy Fuhrer. He was also a Reichsleiter, and was involved in organising the Nuremberg rally, and giving the opening speech, and he would introduce Hitler to the rapturous crowds. But his office was involved in drafting the Nuremberg laws, which imposed strict laws and restrictions on Jews. These rules later resulted in the mass deportations to concentration camps, but Hess was a man motivated by his loyalty to Hitler. He did not want power for himself, but further idolisation for Hitler and the Nazi Party. As the war went on, he became more anti-Semitic, and he believed the Second World War had been caused by Jews, and he would continue to give speeches during the conflict blaming them. But he was a man who was a hypochondriac, and he believed he had many different problems with his health, and when he had meetings with Hitler at the Berghof, he even brought his own food, but Hitler disapproved of this. But as the war progressed, Hess believed he was falling from Hitler's affections, and with this he was worried about a war on two fronts, and he believed it would break Germany, and then he decided to try and negotiate with the British to end hostilities with them. He trained in a Messerschmitt Bf-110, and would take this aircraft on a remarkable flight where he managed to get to Scotland, and he managed to make it within 20 miles of his destination, where he planned to meet with the Duke of Hamilton, believing he would be able to be part of the peace talks. But Hess was captured by members of the Home Guard, and Churchill could not believe that they had captured the Deputy Fuhrer of the Nazi Party. In Germany he was portrayed as a madman who had lost all sense of normality, and Goebbels said in propaganda that he was mentally ill and should never have been in a position of power. Following his capture, Hitler stripped him of all his ranks and ordered him to be executed on sight if he ever set foot in Germany again. Hess told the Duke of Hamilton that he was on a mission of humanity and that Hitler wanted to end hostilities with Britain, but Hess's flight was announced across the radio and it caused a huge degree of confusion. After this he was considered a prisoner of war, and he was sent to the Tower of London, the very site where two of Henry VIII's wives lost their heads, and he was then sent to a mansion in Surrey for 13 months. Hess was to be treated well, but he was not allowed to learn about the war, and he was guarded by a huge number of soldiers. He underwent a number of psychological investigations that claimed he was mentally unstable, and his behaviour at times would be irrational. On the 16th of June 1942, he tried to take his own life by rushing guards and jumping over the railings of a staircase, which resulted in him fracturing his leg. Because of this, he was kept under close guard and was transferred to a different hospital facility, where he was kept for 3 years. He was allowed walks on the grounds, but he tried to take his own life again, this time stabbing himself in February 1945 with a bread knife. But after the end of the war and the German surrender, Hess was accused of being a war criminal and was sent to Nuremberg to be part of the Nuremberg trials. He was charged with 4 crimes: conspiracy to commit crimes, crimes against peace, war crimes and crimes against humanity, but also violating international law. He was a difficult man in captivity and was clearly not right. He began to exhibit amnesia, and he hoped that possibly being insane could result in him avoiding the death penalty. He did have a good defence in the courtroom, and despite the court deliberating for 2 months, he was found guilty on 2 of the 4 counts. Because he was not found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, he was saved from the hangman's noose and was instead given a life sentence. Whilst at Spandau prison, he was under the watchful eyes of rotating guards from the UK, US, France and the Soviet Union. Hess was prisoner number 7, and he would receive only a small amount of paper to write letters with, and he was not allowed to speak with the other Nazis without permission. He was expected to help with chores and was permitted to have an hour's walk in the gardens a day. As time went on, the rules got more relaxed, but Hess was hesitant to allow his family to come and visit. He would cry and wait throughout the night and claim his food was poisoned, but more attempts on his own life came, and he spent the rest of his life at Spandau prison. The rest of the Nazis were released, but Hess remained inside of Spandau, and despite being the last Nazi and being allowed to do almost what he wanted, he would die within the prison walls. In September 1979, he was suffering from prostate cancer which could have killed him, but he remained a Nazi and refused to apologise for anything he had done. But on the 17th of August 1987, at the age of 93, Hess was found dead in a summer room, inside of the prison garden. It was said he had died using an extension cord over the window latch, and a note was found in his pocket to his family thanking them. But there was much debate about his death, and there was even speculation that it was a body double who died. But this would be disproved using DNA on his remains in 2019. However, Hess after his death was initially buried in what was thought to have been a secret location. But this was then found, and neo-Nazis would hold rallies and gatherings around Hess's grave, and because of this he was exhumed for the first time. The former Deputy Fuhrer's remains were dug up in the middle of the night by the authorities, and were then moved to Wunsiedel in Bavaria on the 17th of March 1988, just less than a year since he had died. When his wife died 7 years later, she was also buried with him in this family plot. But the problem still remained about Hess, and his grave yet again became a site of pilgrimage for neo-Nazis, despite his remains being moved once more. Every August on the anniversary of his death, the groups would take a pilgrimage to the gravesite, and demonstrations would take place. Because of the chaos this was causing, the council had agreed not to permit the lease on the grave to be extended when it expired in 2011. Hess had requested in his will to be buried in Wunsiedel, as it was where his family had a holiday home, and also where his parents were already buried. It was a local Lutheran church who had supervised the ceremony, and they initially gave the reburial of Hess, as they said it would have been wrong to ignore the last wishes of a dead man. But as mentioned, the grave became a site of pilgrimage, and Nazi wreaths were laid at the site, and the Hitler salute was performed around his grave. A member of the church council said the whole town was shut down in turmoil, and there was a huge police presence. We here at the graveyard were not able to cope. Because of this, the authorities then decided yet again to exhume and disinter the remains of Rudolf Hess for one final time. The granddaughter of Hess objected that it was wrong to exhume his remains and go against his final wishes. However, the parish council ignored this and went ahead with the exhumation. One resident said, "Perhaps we will now have some peace when he is gone. Perhaps they won't come any more," which is what Wunsiedel wants. Under the cover of darkness, Hess's remains were dug up from the grave in secret, and his grave was opened on the 20th of July 2011. After this, the remains were then transported to a nearby crematorium, where the decaying remains of Rudolf Hess were then cremated, and were reduced to ashes. These were given to his family members, who scattered them at sea. The gravestone which contained his name and the German inscription which read, "I have dared," was then broken up and destroyed, removing any reference to Hess in the graveyard. It was confirmed that his grave had been emptied, and that his body had been removed from the cemetery to deter Nazis coming back. The deputy mayor later said, "Hopefully we can put this all behind us. We hope the phantom has left." Rudolf Hess is a captivating and interesting figure, who was considered to have been the last Nazi. Spandau Prison, where he spent his last 40 years of his life, was later demolished to prevent it being a shrine, but it was a place where Hess's life came to an end. He was a man who was a Deputy Fuhrer, and a man who was loyal to Hitler and was trusted, until his failed flight to Scotland occurred, and he was shunned and portrayed as a man who lost his faculties. His exhumation is one which was caused by threats posed by Nazi groups in Germany decades after the war and the end of the Nazi Party, and Hess's remains were not laid to rest, as each year thousands of people will head to the gravesite to venerate him. But he was a dangerous man, and was someone who was considered a man who could have easily been executed following the Nuremberg trials, alongside other prominent Nazis. Josef Kramer, following a period of unemployment during the 1920s, became aware of the politics of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. He was someone who became attracted to the ideas being preached by the Nazis, and he went further as he joined the party officially on the 1st of December 1931. But he then also joined the SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary death squads, who were the administrators, guards and executioners of the concentration camps. The SS became some of the most horrific war criminals of the conflict, and Kramer was one of these. He first served inside of a concentration camp when he was sent to Dachau, the first site that opened in 1934, and he was then moved to other camps such as Sachsenhausen, then Mauthausen, where terrifying quarries were complete with the stairs of death. But Josef Kramer then became friends with some high-ranking members of the SS, and he was made an adjutant or assistant to Rudolf Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz. Hess was the man who created the camp of Auschwitz, and he expanded the small site into a large and deadly concentration camp, and the deadliest of the Third Reich. Hess was responsible for the slaughter of over 1 million people, and Kramer, as an assistant, was very good friends with him. He gave Hess advice, and also he accompanied him on a number of inspections, before he was then given command of his own camp. This was Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp, which had been established inside the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which belonged to the French. But inside of the fences, Kramer got his hands dirty, and he got involved in executions and deaths. He ordered the gassings of 80 Jewish women and men, as their remains were then sent to a university to become part of a horrific exhibition. But Josef Kramer then admitted that the aim of the camp was to force prisoners to work in the quarries, and he did later say that he sent people to the gas chambers. However, Josef Kramer was promoted further, and he became a Hauptsturmführer, but he then was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau to oversee the exterminations of hundreds of thousands of people. Kramer was the commandant of Auschwitz II, Birkenau, the main extermination site, and he was in control of the camp's crematoriums. He was seen actively participating in the selections, in which new arrivals were sent to their deaths immediately after entering the camp, but Kramer later claimed that, "I never took part in the selections. I asked myself, is it really right about these persons who go to the gas chambers? I did not know what the purpose of the gas chamber was." But many witnesses later at his trial proved this wrong, and they noted that Kramer was seen regularly beating prisoners who were loaded onto trucks to be sent to their deaths immediately. He was also involved in the bloody aftermath of the Auschwitz Revolt of October 1944, and he carried out a number of executions. But Kramer inside of Birkenau was responsible for many other guards who were brutal, such as Irma Grese, and he allowed his guard staff to have dogs, and these were encouraged to attack and maim prisoners, and there were many other inmates who were slaughtered willingly by his guards. Kramer was a man who was hell-bent on inflicting suffering, but then as the Second World War began to turn against the Germans, he was then sent on to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Inside of Belsen, conditions were truly horrific, and there were thousands of prisoners who were sent there to keep them out of the hands of the enemy. Belsen was a camp which was intended to hold less than 10,000 prisoners, and it became incredibly overpopulated, with dozens of thousands being sent there, and the strain on the camp led to a collapse of the infrastructure. There was little to no food given out, poor sanitation, if any, and there were also diseases which spread around the site, leading to thousands of deaths every single week. There were corpses all around the camp, and Josef Kramer was responsible for this, and he did nothing to help the situation inside of Belsen, and he also refused to abandon his post as the commandant of Belsen. Many of his guards fled as the Allies were advancing in attempts to save themselves from arrest, but Kramer remained, along with a number of other ardent Nazis, to maintain the camp's hierarchy. When the British and Canadian forces liberated the camp, they found a horrific sight of slaughter and depravity. They were disgusted by the state of the camp, but amongst the over 10,000 corpses found there were some prisoners incredibly emaciated who were clinging on to their lives. The British then ordered the seized SS guards to help clean up the dead. They were then interred inside of mass graves. However, Josef Kramer was arrested when the British entered the camp, and he was then brought to the Belsen trials, alongside other guards and staff at Belsen, and he was accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, not just at Belsen, but also at Auschwitz. The courtroom heard how ruthless and brutal he was, and he was seen battering prisoners and sending those to their deaths. But during the selection processes, he was also witnessed, as mentioned, driving people to their deaths, and he was said to have kicked one woman to death during this. He also killed prisoners from the Soviet Union, and was known for shooting those who were found eating mere scraps to just survive. But for his crimes of the Second World War and before, Josef Kramer was sentenced to death, and he was then sent to Hamlin prison to await his execution, which took place on the 13th of December 1945. In the days before, Kramer had met with the British executioner Albert Pierpoint, who had been summoned to carry out the executions, and Pierpoint took Kramer's weight and height to estimate the drop needed on the gallows to instantly snap his neck and kill him. Kramer was to be executed with 10 of his former guard staff. These executions began at 9:30 a.m. in the morning, and the condemned women, including Irma Grese, were executed first. Then Josef Kramer would be fetched. He was held in a small cell next to the execution chamber, and then Pierpoint, along with the prison guards, summoned him, and he was brought into the execution chamber. The executions were carried out in pairs, and at 12:15 p.m, alongside the evil Dr. Fritz Klein, Josef Kramer was taken from his cell and was led towards the gallows. There were 2 nooses on this structure, and Kramer was then helped up the steps of the scaffold. His arms had been secured behind his back, but Pierpoint worked very quickly. At 12:19 p.m, Kramer went crashing through the trapdoor after a black cap had been placed over his head, and Kramer was the first of the men, alongside Klein, who were executed in the Belsen trial executions. Death was confirmed shortly after, and the body of Josef Kramer was then cut down, and it was then to be buried inside the prison courtyard. But this would not be the end of Josef Kramer's story. After being interred inside of the prison yard of Hamlin, alongside the other condemned war criminals, he was left for a number of years. However, the time then came when the British were to give control of Hamlin prison back to the Germans as they would leave, and because of this the graves of the condemned guards of the Belsen trials, including the grave of Josef Kramer, was disturbed. The coffins were dug up and were disinterred, and this included Kramer, Grese, Volkenrath, and all the others whom Pierpoint executed that day. In 1950 the British handed Hamlin back to the Germans, and at this point there was a great concern about pro-Nazi groups in the country. Some people shockingly wanted to give those executed guards what was classed as a proper and decent burial, and a Nazi send-off, and it was in March 1954 when the bodies were exhumed and the ground was broken to dig these people up. The coffins were exhumed and specialists identified each of the remains, and their bones were then placed inside of new coffins and were prepared for reburial somewhere else. There were in total 91 bodies of the executed Nazi war criminals exhumed, and Kramer's was obviously one of them. The beast of Belsen's remains had been placed in a new coffin, meaning the old one had either been opened or it had decayed, and the remains were then taken to the nearby Hamlin am Vale cemetery. Kramer's body alongside the others was buried inside the cemetery that held the remains of ordinary civilians and former World War I soldiers, but where the bodies of the executed were interred, there were strict orders to begin with to prevent the site becoming a shrine for neo-Nazis. No memorials to begin with were allowed, but later crosses were permitted to mark the graves, but the neo-Nazis then began to gather around the burial sites. The people of Hamlin were not very happy with this, and one newspaper article of the time stated, "British occupation forces refused to interfere with German authorities who moved the bodies from a mass grave to individual plots in the city cemetery after a campaign by neo-Nazi elements in Hamlin, Lower Saxony. 30 of the 90 bodies of the executed Nazi war criminals have already been moved from a common mass grave near Hamlin and reinterred in a city cemetery. The remaining bodies will be moved later. Amongst those reburied are Josef Kramer, named the Beast of Belsen, by inmates of the notorious death camp, and Irma Grese, who hounded women prisoners at Belsen. Today the gravesite of Josef Kramer and the other executed former guards of Bergen-Belsen is allegedly just a small patch of grass by a path, which looks rather normal and discreet, and those who visit the graveyard probably do not know that they are walking by the remains of some of the most evil war criminals of the Second World War. Josef Kramer was a brutal and barbaric man who had little regard for the lives of the prisoners who were incarcerated inside of his various camps that he oversaw, and he did not seem to hold back in his actions in executing, torturing, and inflicting suffering onto others. He gained the nickname the Beast of Belsen for his work inside of the Third Reich's plans for destruction, but he was a man who was dug up and exhumed following his execution. There had been calls to get rid of the remains once and for all, as other nations would, following executions, cremate the condemned, then scatter the ashes. But still today the body of the Beast of Belsen lies on Earth. Magda Goebbels was born in 1901 in Berlin, and she was married before she met Josef. Whilst travelling by train in 1920, she met Gunter Quandt, a rich and wealthy German industrialist who was twice her age, but he wooed her with wealthy gestures and gifts. They married on the 4th of January 1921, and they had a child named Harold. However, her husband had little time for her, and in 1929, Gunther discovered that Magda was having an affair, and they later divorced. But in 1930, Magda was at a meeting of the Nazi Party, when a provocative and passionate speaker, Josef Goebbels, came onto the stage. She was very impressed by him, and then Magda became more involved in the Nazi Party, and she moved to the party's headquarters in Berlin, and was a secretary to Goebbels' deputy. However, the pair then became romantically involved in 1931, following a trip, and Goebbels said, "We've made a solemn vow to each other. When we have conquered the Reich, we will become man and wife. I am very happy." The pair to begin with were head over heels in love, and Magda's flat would be a place where many senior Nazis, including Hitler, would regularly gather. But the Goebbels relationship did encounter problems, and Josef was often very jealous of Hitler's affection for Magda, and the couple were married on the 19th of December 1931. But she was very ambitious, and she wanted to be at the very top, and the couple had 6 children, and Hitler was very fond of them. But as mentioned, Magda had a very close relationship with the dictator of Nazi Germany, and she would answer letters from all over Germany from women about domestic issues, and she was seen as a good representative for women. But the Goebbels family lived in luxury, but Josef had an affair with many women, including the Czech actress Lida Barova, and their affair got more intense, to the point where Josef was contemplating leaving Magda. But Hitler would intervene, and he refused to allow one of his most senior ministers to be involved in scandal, and he ordered Josef to break off the affair, and then return to life with Magda, reconciled. But during the war, Magda's first son became a Luftwaffe pilot, but the couple would display utmost loyalty to Hitler in public. But Magda became concerned as the war went on about Hitler, and how the German war effort was going downhill on the Eastern Front. She would state that Hitler no longer listens to the voices of reason. Those who tell him what he wants to hear are the only ones he believes. But she was an ardent Nazi, but it was claimed that she did help a few people with exit visas. But she was a woman who was rather sickly also, and she had a weak heart, and often became very ill. At the end of the war she became depressed, and she also suffered with neuralgia. But as the Second World War came to an end, in April 1945 the Soviets had encircled Berlin, and it was looking likely that the war was lost for the Germans. People who were once loyal to Hitler began to flee and look after their own affairs, but the Goebbels family remained incredibly devoted to Hitler. They believed that life without Hitler was not worth living at all. They moved into the Vorbunker, the Führerbunker's neighbour, which was connected to Hitler's underground headquarters. Magda there wrote to her son Harold, who had been captured in North Africa, and she wrote, "Harold, my beloved son, by now we've been in the Führerbunker for 6 days already. Daddy, your 6 little siblings and I, for the sake of giving our National Socialistic lives the only possible honourable end. You shall know that I stayed here against Daddy's will, and that even on the last Sunday the Führer wanted to help me get out. You know your mother, we have the same blood. For me there is no wavering. Our glorious idea is ruined, and with it everything beautiful and marvellous that I've known in my life. The world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is not any longer worth living, and therefore I took the children with me, for they are too good for the life that would follow, and a merciful God will understand me when I give them salvation. The children are wonderful. There never is a word of complaint or crying. The impacts are shaking the bunker. The elder children cover the younger ones. Their presence is a blessing. They are making the Fuhrer smile once in a while. May God help that I have their strength to perform the last and hardest. We only have one goal left, loyalty to the Fuhrer, even in death. Harold, my dear son, I want to give you what I learned in life. Be loyal. Loyal to yourself, loyal to your people, and loyal to your country. Be proud of us and try and keep us in dear memory. Josef Goebbels and Magda vowed to not leave Berlin, and Magda supported this, and the decision was made that they too, along with Hitler, would die inside the bunker. Magda was one of the last people to see Hitler and Eva Braun alive, but on the day after they died, Magda and Josef made the shocking decision to kill their children. They arranged for an SS dentist to inject their children with morphine and then crush an ampoule of cyanide into their mouths. The children were later found, and it was alleged it was Magda who administered the cyanide to her children herself. This would have made Magda a woman who was happy to kill her own children, and she even declined offers to take them away, and she was worried that they would be considered the offspring of war criminals, or that they would fall into the hands of the Soviets. It was said that, straight after Hitler's death, Mrs. Goebbels came down to the bunker with her children. She started preparing to kill them. She couldn't have done that above ground. There were other people there who would have stopped her. That's why she came downstairs, because no one else was allowed in the bunker. She came down on purpose to kill them. 2 hours after the children had been killed, she then went to the Fuhrer bunker and looked very pale and her face was frozen. But now it was time for Magda and Goebbels to go the same way as her children and Hitler. They went for a walk in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, near to where Hitler's remains had been burned, and whilst here they took their own lives. There are differing accounts as to how this happened. One stated that they both bit down on cyanide close to where Hitler had been buried and burned, and then following this, an SS adjutant issued a shot to their heads to make sure they were dead. Goebbels' adjutant, Gunther Schweigmann, stated that Magda and Josef walked in front of him up the stairs and into the garden. Schweigmann waited until he heard gunshots. Then he went up and saw their bodies, and Schweigmann then ordered an SS officer to fire several shots into their bodies, which did not move. After this they were covered in petrol and set on fire, but the lack of petrol and fuel in Berlin at the time led to the remains only being partially burned, and they were not buried. It was on the 2nd of May 1945 that the remains were found by the Soviet forces, showing how close the pair were to falling into the hands of the Soviets. Magda's remains were said to have burned better than her husband's, as Josef's body was recognisable. It was said in a Soviet autopsy that her jawbone and dental remains were found detached in the oral cavity. However, the remains of Goebbels' family, along with Hans Krebs and Hitler's dogs, were then allegedly buried nearby. It was written in an NKVD report that, in the mouth of the corpses I found glass pieces of wall and of floor corresponding to material in the bunker. There was a strong smell of bitter almonds, the smell of cyanide which killed them. It was said that the bodies in this letter had been buried in a secret location inside a book. However, this was not the end of the story, as Magda Goebbels was exhumed. Schmerz officers were ordered in the summer of 1945, literally months after the bodies had been interred, to dig them up. Hitler, Eva Braun and the Goebbels family were exhumed, and they were then moved to Rafenau, 55 miles from Berlin. But then on the 13th of January 1946, they would be disinterred yet again. They were dug up in Rafenau by a committee led by Schmerz Lieutenant General Selenium. This is where part of Hitler's skull was sent to Stalin, but the bodies were yet again moved, this time to Magdeburg in East Germany. Magda's body was part of this, and in the yard of number 36 West End Street, at the base of a local Schmerz unit, further examinations of the bodies continued. It seemed like the Soviets were only bothered though with the remains of Hitler, and Magda's remains were left probably inside the box it had been initially interred with. But the bodies were then buried inside the courtyard here, in wooden ammunition boxes. Identification reports were sent to Stalin to show that the remains were allegedly of Hitler and Magda Goebbels. But the body of Magda Goebbels remained there for 24 years undetected, and this facility was heavily guarded, and no one would have known who really was buried inside of the courtyard. But 24 years after they were interred, the Kremlin understood that the burial site was about to be given over to the People's Army of the German Democratic Republic. Because of this, Leonid Brezhnev received a letter saying that the bodies of Hitler, Magda and Josef Goebbels and the others should be disinterred and moved for a final time. Tasked to do this were 3 Smersh agents, Major Shirokov, Captain Kovalenko and Vladimir Gumacek, and they were given gas masks and were told to make it look as if they were dealing with vermin with sulphur, and they did not want to attract attention to the disinterment. They started digging on the 4th of April 1970, and as they began to dig, they found the ammunition boxes containing the remains, and inside one they found Magda Goebbels' gold teeth. The bodies were placed in empty weapon boxes and were taken away in a truck. This truck had fishing rods hanging out the back to disguise what they were carrying, and then in Schönbeck, later that day, the remains of Magda Goebbels and her husband, and Hitler and Eva Braun, were burned along with Hans Krebs. The ashes were then thrown into a sack and taken north, where they were dumped in the Eila River. Magda Goebbels was the wife of Josef Goebbels, who was incredibly close with Hitler, and she was referred to as the First Lady of Nazi Germany at times. Inside the Reich Chancellery Garden, she along with her husband would perish as Berlin was encircled by the Soviets. Her marriage with Goebbels was a strange one at times, and she had a number of affairs, as did her husband, but they were binded by their devotion to Hitler and the Nazi Party. Her remains were dug up a number of times after her death, and each time it would have been a very shocking sight to have seen. Carin Goring was born Carin Alexina Hulda Fock on the 21st of October 1888 in Stockholm in Sweden. Her father was a baron and was a colonel inside of the Swedish army, and her family were of part Germanic origin. The family had a number of links to other countries, including her grandfather, who was a Coldstream British Guard. But in 1910 she married a Swedish army officer named Nils von Kanthal, and the pair had a child named Thomas. She was married when she met the ex-First World War pilot Hermann Goering, who at the time was trying to make money flying mail and passengers between Germany and Sweden. He was also working as a pilot for a commercial airline, and he was visiting the castle where he'd flown Carin's brother-in-law. It was said that it was love at first sight, despite Carin being married, and the couple would meet up in Stockholm. She was a separated woman with a young child, and following her divorce in December 1922, she and Hermann married on the 3rd of February 1923. The couple then moved to Germany, and Carin then became involved in her husband's political life. She followed her husband in becoming a member of the Nazi Party, and Goering was heavily involved in the early days and foundations of the party. He was part of the Munich Putsch and was injured when he was shot at, and his wife smuggled Goering out of Germany and took him to Austria and then Italy, and nursed him back to health. However, Carin was not the most well woman, and she was rather sickly. The stress of the political landscape in Germany, and also the struggles she and her husband experienced following the Munich Putsch, led to her suffering with her health. She had chronic asthma, and it's believed angina, and in 1925 she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a terrible disease which throughout the centuries had killed thousands. But Carin and Hermann's relationship was used by Goebbels as the ideal German love story, and the couple went on trips around Germany to rally for the Nazi cause. But in September 1931, Carin got a call saying that her mother had died, and then she travelled to Sweden to attend the funeral. She was greatly upset by the news, however she was not well and her health was fragile. But the next day, after her mother's funeral, at the age of 42, she had a heart attack and died days later of heart failure on the 17th of October 1931. Her husband, Hermann, was devastated, and in the years after her death, her older sister wrote a biography of her life, which sold almost around 1 million copies in the following years in Germany. It was a bestseller in the country, but after her death, Carin was buried in the Fock family plot at Lovo churchyard at Drottningholm Island in Lake Mälaren to the west of Stockholm. However, in 1933, Goering commissioned the building of Carinhall, a huge hunting lodge which was named after his first wife. Following the Nazi seizure of power, Goering visited Sweden in early 1933, and he visited his wife's grave, and he laid a wreath of red roses in the shape of the Nazi swastika. This was criticised in the media, and anti-Nazis removed the tribute. But Goering was furious at this, and he was outraged at the removal of the tribute he somehow deemed was fitting. Because of this, he decided to then order the removal of his wife's remains and body from Sweden. His plan was to exhume Carin's remains, then have her buried at Carinhall, and this is exactly what he did. He began to construct an ornate mausoleum, which would be underground, to hold her remains. It's believed Goering eventually dreamed that he himself would be laid to rest there. On the 19th of June 1934, Carin Goring's coffin was exhumed from Lovo graveyard, and despite being in the ground for years, it was draped in a flag containing the swastika, and was then transported to Germany and to Carinhall. The following day, a huge Nazi ceremony took place, and the ceremony was even attended by Hitler and many other senior Nazis. She was interred inside the mausoleum for 11 years, and during this time Hermann visited her every day when he was living at Carinhall. Despite being remarried, his second wife, Emmy, did not mind living in the home dedicated to his first wife, and she did not seem to mind Hermann paying his respects to her. However, as the Second World War waged on, Hermann Goering would become one of the most infamous Nazi war criminals. His home was adorned with art stolen from Jews and others, and he would go on to be responsible for many other war crimes. These crimes would later see Goering sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials, but before this, on the 20th of April 1945, the Soviet artillery was encroaching on the area near to Carinhall. Because of the Soviet advancements, Goering saw it as dangerous to go to Carinhall, and because of this, he abandoned it and left for Berlin. He gave instructions to the guards to plant dynamite in the house and all the other buildings, and outbuildings. But there were no instructions left to destroy the mausoleum, but Goering also made no provisions as to remove Carin's body. He must have believed that the Soviets could have looted her tomb, which they did when they reached Carinhall. They would have entered the mausoleum and caused chaos and broke into Carin's coffin, and it's possible stole some of her remains or bones. But 5 years after the war, a Swedish priest began to investigate what happened to Carin Goring and her remains at the end of the war. He travelled to Germany and then went to Carinhall. This was very dangerous and he risked arrest doing this. This priest then allegedly found the mausoleum and he entered where the tomb was, and he then gathered as many bones as he quickly could from the tomb and placed them in a potato sack and then had them taken to Sweden. These bones were then cremated and were then reinterred in the churchyard. However, the story of Carin Goring's remains in 1991 then took a shocking twist. The previous remains had been described as nothing more than a human torso, but in 1991, treasure hunters found a zinc coffin with skeletal remains in the forest near to the location of the destroyed Carinhall. The men excavated it, and then these remains were handed over to the Swedish church in Berlin. They were then sent to the Swedish National Board of Forensic Medicine for identification and examination. 26 bones from the cranium and upper body were received, and they showed different signs of post-mortem trauma. This meant that her bones had been broken after death, and the arm had been shattered. Testing using DNA on the remains showed that the bones were of a female, and DNA analysis supported the theory that these bones found inside of the Schorf-Heide forest in 1991 were the remains of Carin Goring. What is strange is what must have happened to her remains in the final moments of the war. It's possible that German guards moved her remains and buried them to make sure they stayed out the hands of the Soviets, but what is curious is the fact that the Soviets did allegedly break into her tomb. But her remains may have been moved, or part of her may have been moved into the forest to keep her out of Soviet hands. But Carin Goring was the wife of Hermann, who was buried a number of times, and was reinterred and exhumed also a number of times. Her death devastated her husband, who would during World War II become one of the most terrible Nazi war criminals, and he was incredibly close with Hitler. Carin's husband would later have the last say against the executioner on the day of his scheduled execution, and he would escape the hangman's noose. Hans Krebs worked in the Defence Ministry in the 1930s, and he was a very anti-Semitic and anti-communist man. He was virulently brutal with his attitude towards these people, and in 1936 he was sent to the German embassy in Moscow, and he served as a military attaché. However, during the Second World War, Krebs became the chief of staff of a number of army groups. He served on the Eastern Front and he became a general major within the Chief of Staff of the Ninth Army. He then became a General of Infantry in August 1944 and he served as the Chief of Staff of Army Group B on the Western Front from September 1944 to February 1945. But on the 1st of April 1945, Krebs became the Chief of the Army General Staff and he remained inside of the Führer bunker during the Battle of Berlin. He was inside the bunker with Hitler during the final moments of the war in Europe. On the 28th of April 1945, he made a final telephone call from the Führer bunker. He spoke with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel in Fürstenberg, which had been set up as the new Supreme Command headquarters. He told Keitel that the war was lost if help didn't get there within 2 days. Keitel then tried to put pressure on other German generals to try and help in Berlin, and Hitler had ordered the 12th and 9th Army to unite to help relieve Berlin of the Soviets, who were battering the city. However, Hans Krebs inside the bunker still had a very senior position inside of the army. On the 28th of April 1945, it was discovered that Heinrich Himmler was trying to negotiate a surrender with the Allies. Because of this, Krebs was part of a military tribunal set up to court-martial Himmler's liaison officer for the bunker, Hermann Fegelein. Fegelein was actually Eva Braun's brother-in-law, and Krebs was in charge of the proceedings, along with SS General Wilhelm Mohnke. They ordered Fegelein to be found, and he was then sentenced to death and was found incredibly drunk. But he was then shot dead outside the bunker's walls. But on the 29th of April, Hans Krebs was one of the witnesses that signed the last will and testament of Adolf Hitler. He was one of those that signed the document, which was dictated to Trauder Junge, Hitler's personal secretary. That evening, Krebs asked Alfred Jodl for information. He said, "Request immediate report. Firstly, of the whereabouts of Vensk spearheads, as in the 12th Army. Secondly, of time intended to attack. Thirdly, of location of the 9th Army. Fourthly, of the precise place in which the 9th Army will break through. Fifthly, the whereabouts of General Hochster's spearhead, meaning the 12th Army." With this, it's interesting to consider that Krebs must have believed that the war was not over yet. Jodl would deliver the news the next day, which Krebs did not want, saying some of the forces had been bogged down and others were surrounded. It was later that afternoon that Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives. But following Hitler's death, things were happening quickly inside of the Führer bunker. Goebbels then sent Krebs under a white flag to deliver a letter to Soviet General Vasily Choykov. The letter had surrender terms that Goebbels believed were acceptable. Choykov, the commander of the Soviet 8th Guards Army, arrived in central Berlin, and Krebs, who spoke Russian, informed Choykov that Hitler and Eva Braun were dead. Choykov did not know about the bunker complex under the Reich Chancellery, and that Hitler was married, but he did not accept the surrender terms, and he wasn't ready to negotiate with Krebs. The Soviets were only willing to accept the unconditional surrender of the Nazis, and Krebs was told not to agree to this, so the meeting ended with no resolution. The fighting continued in Berlin, and Goebbels then decided to take his own life inside the Führer bunker. Following Goebbels' death, Krebs then began to consider his own mortality. It was General Helmer Feidling, the commander of the Berlin defence area, who had the authority to surrender the city. Krebs had no such power to do this, and Choykov was under the impression that Krebs was the one who could do this. However, Wiedling would tell Choykov about Krebs looking as if he was about to die by his own hand. As the Soviets advanced towards the Reich Chancellery, Krebs was last seen by Trauder Junge and others who attempted a breakout to try and escape. Junge said she approached Krebs to say goodbye, and that he smoothed out his uniform before he said goodbye one last time. Krebs would not attempt to break out, and along with General Wilhelm Bergdorf and an SS Obersturmbannführer, they remained inside the bunker. In the early hours of the 2nd of May, Krebs and Bergdorf both died by gunshot to the head. Their bodies were later found and retrieved when the Soviets stumbled across the bunker and entered the complex. But this was not the end of Krebs's remains. They were not charred or burned unlike Magda and Josef Goebbels's. Krebs's body, along with the Goebbels family and the remains of Hitler's dog, were buried, it's believed, in Buch in a secret location. But then his remains were exhumed. In the summer of 1945, months after his body had been buried, Schmerz officials and officers were ordered to disinter Krebs along with the Goebbels family and Hitler's remains. Krebs was dug up and his body was moved to Rafnau, 55 miles from Berlin. On the 13th of January 1946, they were dug up yet again, as he was moved by a Schmerz committee led by Lieutenant General Selenium. Part of Hitler's skull at this time was then sent to Stalin, but Krebs's body was moved then again to Magdeburg, which was further inside East Germany. In the yard of number 36 West End Street, which was the base of a local Schmerz unit, examinations of Krebs's remains took place. The bodies were then buried inside the courtyard of this building, and they were buried inside wooden ammunition boxes. Krebs's remains were left here for 24 years, but then the Kremlin learned that his burial site would be handed over to the People's Army of the German Democratic Republic. Leonid Brezhnev then said that the remains should be disinterred one final time. Krebs's wooden box containing his body was dug up for one last time on the 4th of April 1970, and 3 Schmerz agents found his body. They disguised what they were doing to keep utmost secrecy, and then the box containing Krebs's body was placed on the back of a truck. The truck was disguised further, and it was then driven to Schönbeck. Whilst here, General Krebs's remains were cremated, and the ashes were then thrown in a sack and were then dumped in the Eila River. The remains of General Hans Krebs were dug up a number of times and were cremated 25 years after he had died. His remains passed under Soviet hands for a number of years, and he was a man who stayed loyal to Hitler until the very end. He decided that life without Hitler was not worth living, and he was a man who could possibly have faced the Nuremberg trials if he had lived. He was a man who had intricate knowledge of the Führer bunker and of Hitler during the final moments of the war in Europe, but he was a commander who was very experienced in the German military. Irma Grese during her teenage years was desperate to join the League of German Girls, the Nazi youth group for young women and teenage girls. It was similar to the Hitler Youth, but Irma's father banned her from joining this. However, she attended behind her father's back, along with her sister, and she became brainwashed by the Nazis' politics. At the age of 14 she left school, after she left home, and she worked as a farmhand for 6 months before she worked in a shop in Luschen. She may have left home due to her father's disapproval with her involvement with the Nazi groups, but it was clear she was beginning to become a woman who was obsessed with Hitler and the Nazis' way of life. She initially was a quiet girl who did not display violent tendencies, and she ran away from fights, but this would change. In 1939, Irma Grese went to study nursing at the Hohenlychen Hospital, where many SS members went to convalesce, and she trained under Karl Gebhardt, a horrific Nazi doctor. Gebhardt would be involved in a number of Nazi sadistic experiments inside of the concentration camps, but Grese rubbed shoulders with many SS members and other virulent Nazis. But she was told that she would not make it as a nurse there, and she was deemed not good enough and was told to look for work elsewhere. But Karl Gebhardt had informed one of his friends at Ravensbrück concentration camp that Grese had potential, and despite being told to come back 6 months later when she was 18, she became a female guard at Ravensbrück. At the time she had to pass a number of exams, but she became one of around 2,500 women who would serve inside of the concentration camps during the Second World War. She was hired to train as a guard, and she went through the training routine, and she was told and forced into becoming a brute. It's believed on her first day that she was actually apologising to an inmate before she was told how to deal correctly with this sort of incident, whipping and beating the prisoner. Grese continued to work at Ravensbrück, and she became known for her beatings which she administered on the women there, but when she was just 19 it was time for her to move elsewhere. Irma received instruction that she was to be transferred to Auschwitz, and because of this she was sent to the largest concentration camp established in the Third Reich to help guard over the large female prisoner deportations that would arrive there. When she got to Auschwitz she was assigned to the women's camp of Birkenau, the main extermination site where the gas chambers killed thousands. Her duties included commanding the gardening squad, working on telephone exchanges, and also being in control of the post room. But in May 1944, she became an Oberaufseherin, and she was commanding over 30,000 women prisoners in Birkenau's B-22C camp. In this role she became horrifically brutal, and she was known for wearing her heavy boots, carrying her pistol on her, and her whip with her at all times. Grese was known as the Beautiful Beast, or the Blonde Angel of Hell, and she tormented the women constantly. A former prisoner doctor of the camp said, She was the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Her face has an angelic clarity, and her blue eyes were the liveliest and most innocent eyes imaginable. Another prisoner said it defied belief that such a pretty girl could be so cruel. When she walked through the camp with a whip in her hand, she was surrounded by a cloud of choice perfume. She would attack the women using this whip, and sometimes would beat them to death. She also had a role in medical experiments, and one former doctor of Auschwitz said, Irma Grese invariably arrived to watch the operation, kicking the victim if her screams interfered with her pleasure, and giving herself completely to the spasms which shook her entire body, and made saliva run down the corner of her mouth. It's clear she was also a sadist, and she was also a murderer, who would shoot prisoners indiscriminately if they were not working hard enough. She also encouraged her dog to attack prisoners, and during one incident she was on a bike with her dog next to her, and any prisoner who could not keep up with a 16-kilometre walk was mauled by the dog. One witness said of her behaviour, "We were loading the lorries. Before noon we had an unexpected visitor, Aufseherin Irma, with her 2 leashed dogs. Frau Aufseherin Irma, blonde, with an angel face and snake eyes, the camp's chief torturer. We were very careful not to attract her attention. We pushed and pushed. It seemed to take an eternity to roll the car over the hill. The next team was unable to coordinate its efforts. They were completely unnerved by our visitor. They hesitated and lost control of their wagon. It swayed, bowled down the hill and capsized, scattering stone over the whole area. The prisoners were completely broken in spirit. Aufseherin Irma sent the 2 police dogs on them. The girls tried to escape their fangs, but the trained killers easily overtook them. One grabbed a Polish woman who slipped on a rock. The other fell upon a Russian girl. At Irma's orders, the Capo's underlings beat and kicked the girls, still untouched by the dogs. The Capo wrote down the numbers of the delinquent team. The dogs were tearing at the girls' bodies. Irma came closer to observe what they were doing. Her eyes were bloodshot. The sight of the blood seemed to intoxicate her. She panted. She was excited. Everybody could see that. We stood in a trance, as at a gladiatorial combat. But one of her greatest crimes was that she was involved in prisoner selections, and she would personally send thousands of children, women and men to their deaths inside of the gas chambers. She would patrol the rail yards selecting prisoners to die, and this would result in her own execution later. She indulged in all aspects of the camp's life, and even had an SS boyfriend, and allegedly had an affair with the evil doctor Josef Mengele. But as the Second World War was ongoing and going against the Germans, Irma Grese was transferred from Auschwitz, along with a number of female prisoners, with the Red Army on the horizon. She was sent back to Ravensbrück for a short time, before in March 1945 she arrived in Bergen-Belsen. This was a concentration camp which was incredibly overcrowded and was breaking down due to the huge prisoners sent there. She was also reunited at Belsen with many of her former SS guards and friends, including the commandant, Josef Kramer. Whilst at Belsen, Grese continued to demonstrate her evil, forcing inmates to stand for long periods of time, and she also forced prisoners to stand with rocks held above their heads. But she was still being brutal towards prisoners, even as the Allies were close by. But she stayed at Belsen despite having the chance to flee, and she remained to keep law and order. But then the British arrived at Bergen-Belsen. Irma Grese was not immediately arrested, and she was forced to help bury 10,000 corpses, which were lying all around the camp. She was then arrested, and was held at a Wehrmacht tank training academy. She said of her work, "It was our duty to exterminate antisocial elements, so that Germany's future would be assured." She was then brought to trial and was charged with ill treatment, execution, murder, and barbarism at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Following a 9-week trial, she was sentenced to death by hanging, and was one of only 3 female guards sentenced to death during the Belsen trials. Irma Grese was held inside of Hamelin prison, which would be a place where many former SS guards would be executed, inside of the execution chamber there. The night before her execution, she sung Nazi songs early into the morning, and on the 13th of December 1945, she was then to be killed. The women sentenced to death were executed individually, and the men were executed in pairs, and it was British executioner Albert Pierpoint who conducted the execution. Of Grese's death it was said by Pierpoint that, "We climbed the stairs to the cells where the condemned were waiting. A German officer at the door leading to the corridor flung open the door, and we filed past the row of faces and into the execution chamber. The officers stood at attention. Brigadier Patton Walsh stood with his wristwatch raised. He gave me the signal, and a sigh of released breath was audible in the chamber. I walked into the corridor. Irma Grese, I called. The German guards quickly closed all grills on 12 of the inspection holes and opened one door. Irma Grese stepped out. The cell was far too small for me to go inside, and I had to pinion her in the corridor. Follow me, I said in English, and O'Neill repeated the order in German. At 9:34 a.m, she walked into the execution chamber, gazed for a moment at the officials standing round it, then walked on the centre of the trap, where I had made a chalk mark. She stood on the mark very firmly, and as I placed the white cap over her head, she said in her languid voice, "Schnell." The drop crashed down, and the doctor followed me into the pit and pronounced her dead. After 20 minutes the body was taken down and placed in a coffin, ready for burial. But this would not be the end of Irma Grese's story. Her coffin was taken out of the execution chamber, and she was then quickly buried next to the other executed former SS guards, hastily in the yard of Hamlin Prison. Just a stone's throw away from the execution chamber, she was buried in the prison, which was under British control. However, in 1955, Hamlin Prison was scheduled to be closed, and the prisoners were transferred to another prison nearby. However, the graves of the former Nazi guards were then disturbed and disinterred, and this included Irma Grese's coffin. The graves were mass graves from which Grese's coffin was exhumed, and in 1950 the British had handed Hamlin back to the Germans. At the time there was a significant amount of tension in Germany with right-wing elements in society, and some of those groups wanted to give the evil guards such as Irma Grese, Johanna Bormann and Josef Kramer a decent burial. But in March 1954, the authorities began to exhume the bodies from the prison yard. They broke the ground and exhumed the remains, and then specialists identified them. They identified the body and remains of Irma Grese. Her bones were then placed inside of a separate coffin, and it was prepared for reburial in an individual plot. There were 91 bodies which were exhumed, and it was planned to be buried in consecrated ground in Hamlin's Am Vale cemetery. This cemetery held the remains previously of former World War I soldiers, but it was then said that no memorials would be allowed on the graves of the exhumed former guards, but that only wooden crosses would be allowed if the relatives paid for them. One newspaper article of the exhumation said, British occupation authorities refused to interfere with German authorities, who moved the bodies from a mass grave to individual plots in the city cemetery, after a campaign by neo-Nazi elements in Hamlin, Lower Saxony. 30 of the 90 bodies of the executed Nazi war criminals have already been moved from a common mass grave near Hamlin and reinterred in the city's cemetery. The remaining bodies will be moved later. Amongst those reburied are Josef Kramer, named the Beast of Belsen, by inmates of the notorious death camp, and Irma Grese, who hounded women prisoners at Belsen. The World Jewish Congress issued a statement signed by its political secretary, severely criticising the reburial of the Beast of Belsen, who starved, beat and burned tens of thousands of Jewish and other camp inmates whilst he commanded the prison, as well as the other Nazi criminals. So what had happened is that Irma Grese's body had been moved from Hamlin to a nearby graveyard, and it was interred along with many other evil executed Nazi war criminals. But as the years went on, many neo-Nazi groups would visit the gravesite and hold rallies and meetings there, and the wooden crosses that were put up at the site were huge in their number. It was said that Grese's remains were sickeningly for some a tourist trap, and in the 1980s the wooden crosses were removed, and the gravesite just became a grass field. It is marked next to a path, but recently there has been effort to, rather than commemorate the perpetrators of the concentration camps, to instead remember those victims. With this, Irma Grese's resting place today is a grass field near the path, and no references specifically to her remain in that site. Irma Grese was a notorious and disgusting female SS guard, who was known for her evil treatment of prisoners inside many different camps. She was a woman who would be too eager to beat, brutalise and kill with her bare hands, and following her execution, she was exhumed from the place she was initially buried. Much is known about her behaviour at places such as Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, but the story of her exhumation is one which is less known. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.